The restaurant was one of those places where reservations are made months in advance, where the soft glow of candlelight catches on crystal stemware, and the waitstaff moves like synchronized dancers across polished marble floors. I had been looking forward to this night for weeks, our 10th wedding anniversary, a milestone that felt significant in ways I couldn't quite articulate. 10 years of building a life together, of compromise and sacrifice, of early mornings and late nights, of believing that what we had was worth every moment of effort. I wore the emerald dress he'd always loved, the one that made me feel beautiful even on days when exhaustion had carved hollows beneath my eyes. My heels clicked against the pavement as I walked from the parking garage, and I remember thinking how strange it was that we'd driven separately, how his insistence on meeting me there had felt wrong in a way I couldn't name. He'd been so adamant about it that morning, standing in our bedroom with his tie already knotted, his cologne sharp in the air between us. "We should take separate cars tonight," he'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I have a meeting that might run late, and I don't want you waiting around if I get held up. It'll be easier this way." I'd felt a flicker of disappointment, a small wound that I'd immediately tried to rationalize away. He was busy, always so busy with work, with the pharmaceutical sales territory that demanded so much of his time. I'd learned over the years to be understanding, to be flexible, to not make demands that would add to his stress. That's what a good wife does, isn't it? She accommodates, she bends, she makes things easier for everyone else, even when it means swallowing her own needs. But as I'd driven across town alone, watching other couples in their cars, hands linked across center consoles, I'd felt the ache of it. 10 years, and we couldn't even ride to our anniversary dinner together. The thought had settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. I'd arrived early, about 20 minutes before our reservation time, and had decided to wait in the parking garage rather than going in alone. I'd sit in the car, touch up my lipstick, maybe scroll through photos on my phone, the digital scrapbook of our life together that I curated so carefully. Proof that we were happy. Proof that this marriage was everything I'd promised myself it would be. Please leave a comment below. Let me know where you're listening from and get the conversation going. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and support this channel. Back to the story. The parking garage was dimly lit, concrete pillars casting long shadows between the rows of expensive vehicles. I'd pulled into a spot on the third level, turned off the engine, and was reaching for my purse when I saw his car. The silver sedan he'd bought last year, the one he kept immaculate, washing it every Sunday morning with an almost religious devotion. It was parked 2 rows over, and I felt a surge of warmth seeing it there. He'd made it after all, despite his warnings about running late. Maybe he'd wanted to surprise me, to be waiting at our table when I arrived. Maybe this night would be special after all. I'd grabbed my clutch and was about to get out when his passenger door opened. A woman emerged, straightening her dress, running her fingers through her hair in that universal gesture of women checking their appearance. She was younger than me, perhaps early 30s, with the kind of figure that spoke of hours at the gym and the time to maintain it. Her dress was red, tight, expensive. She laughed at something, the sound carrying across the concrete expanse, and then she leaned back into the car. When she straightened again, her lipstick was smeared, and she was using her thumb to wipe it away from the corners of her mouth. My husband stepped out from the driver's side, adjusting his tie, the same tie he'd been wearing when he left our house that morning. He walked around the car, and I watched as he pulled her close, as his hands found the small of her back, as he kissed her again right there in the parking garage where anyone could see, where I could see. The kiss was not chaste or hurried. It was the kiss of two people who had time, who were comfortable with each other, who had done this before, many times before. I sat frozen in my car, my hand still on the door handle, unable to breathe, unable to think. The world had narrowed to just them, to the tableau of betrayal playing out 20 yards away. I watched as they separated, as she said something that made him laugh, as he tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear with an intimacy that made my stomach heave. Then they turned toward the elevator, walking side by side, but not touching now, performing the choreography of discretion. They were going into the restaurant together, our anniversary restaurant. the place where I was supposed to meet my husband to celebrate a decade of marriage. The numbness gave way to something else, something hot and sharp that cut through the shock. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands, and instead of calling him, instead of confronting them, instead of screaming or crying or making a scene, I opened my camera. My fingers felt thick and clumsy, but I managed to take photos. Him with his hand on her back, them kissing, walking toward the restaurant, the license plate of his car, the timestamp on each image burning itself into digital permanence. Then I sat back in my seat and did something that surprised even me. I called my lawyer. The lawyer was someone I'd met through work, a sharp woman who specialized in divorce, and had once told me over coffee that the best time to prepare for the worst was before it happened. I'd laughed then, comfortable in my belief that my marriage was solid, that betrayal was something that happened to other people, to careless people, to people who didn't work hard enough at love. Now, sitting in that parking garage with evidence of my husband's infidelity still displayed on my phone screen, I understood what she'd meant. The call rang twice before she answered, her voice professional even though it was evening. "I need you to meet me tomorrow morning," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded, how calm. "I have photos you need to see. I need to file for divorce, and I need to do it before he knows I know." There was a pause, and then she asked the questions lawyers ask, logistics and confirmations and dates for meetings. We made an appointment for 8 in the morning, early enough that I could go before he woke up, before he expected me to be anywhere but home, making his breakfast and packing his lunch and playing the role I'd perfected over 10 years of marriage. After I hung up, I sat in the car and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me wore a beautiful dress and perfect makeup, but her eyes were dead. This was supposed to be the night we celebrated everything we'd built together. Instead, it was the night everything crumbled, the night I discovered that the foundation I'd trusted was built on lies. But here's what he didn't know. Here's what he couldn't have anticipated in his careful planning of separate cars and convenient excuses. I was not the woman he thought I was. I was not going to fall apart. I was not going to beg or plead or accept promises of it never happening again. I had spent 10 years being accommodating, being understanding, being the supportive wife who asked for nothing and gave everything. That woman died in this parking garage. The woman who was being born in her place was someone different entirely, someone harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous to a man who had underestimated his wife for far too long. I started my car and drove home, leaving the emerald dress occasion unworn for its intended purpose, leaving my husband and his mistress to their dinner. Let them eat. Let them laugh. Let them think they'd gotten away with it for one more night. I had work to do. I had a marriage to dismantle with the same careful precision he'd used to destroy it. And I had evidence. In this modern world, in this age of digital footprints and metadata and geotagging, I had everything I needed to ensure that when this marriage ended, it would end on my terms, not his. The house was empty when I arrived home, exactly as I'd left it hours earlier when I'd been a different woman with different problems. I'd spent the afternoon preparing, cleaning the house until it gleamed, arranging flowers in the vase he'd given me for our 5th anniversary, setting out the good wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. The remnants of that effort mocked me now. I walked through our home, really seeing it for perhaps the first time in years, understanding that every object, every piece of furniture, every photograph on the wall represented not a shared life, but a carefully constructed illusion. The wedding photos in the hallway showed a younger version of us, me in white lace and him in a dark suit, both of us smiling like we'd won the lottery. Had he loved me then? Or had that been a performance too, a role he was playing while he waited for something better to come along? I took the largest frame off the wall, the one from our ceremony, where his hand rested on my waist and my head tilted toward his shoulder, and I placed it face down on the hall table. A small gesture, meaningless perhaps, but it felt like taking back some tiny measure of control. In the bedroom, I opened his closet and stared at the neat rows of shirts and suits, the shoe rack organized by color and occasion, the ties hanging on their special rack. He was a man who valued order, who became irritated when things were out of place, who had strong opinions about how the dishwasher should be loaded and where the remote control belonged. I'd spent a decade accommodating his preferences, molding myself around his requirements, making myself smaller and quieter so he could be comfortable. Now I wondered how many of those business trips had actually been business, how many late nights at the office had been spent with her or with others before her, how many times had he kissed me with lips that had kissed someone else hours before. I changed out of the emerald dress, hanging it in the back of my closet where I wouldn't have to look at it, wouldn't have to remember what it represented. I put on yoga pants and an old sweatshirt, clothes that belonged to the version of myself I was becoming, practical and armored and done with pretending. Then I went to his office, the room he'd claimed as his domain, where he kept his files and his computer and the locked drawer in his desk that he thought I didn't know about. The thing about being married to someone for 10 years is that you learn their patterns, their habits, their hiding places. I knew he kept important papers in that locked drawer. I knew he used our wedding date as the combination for his laptop password, which would have been sweet if it weren't so deeply ironic. I knew he was careful about some things and careless about others, and I knew that men who cheat often do so with a confidence that makes them sloppy. They believe they're too smart to get caught, too careful, too good at maintaining the double life. That confidence was going to be his downfall. I opened the locked drawer with the key I'd found months ago when I was cleaning, the key I'd copied at the hardware store, and put back exactly where I'd found it. Inside were file folders, bank statements, investment documents, and a manila envelope that felt heavy with significance. I pulled it out and opened it, and what I found inside made my hands start shaking again, made my breath come short and fast, made the rage that had been simmering since the parking garage boil over into something that felt almost like hatred. Letters, not emails or text messages, which could be deleted and denied, but actual handwritten letters on expensive stationery. Love letters from multiple women going back years. Some were recent, dated within the last few months, but others were old, faded, their edges worn from being read and reread. This wasn't a new affair. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a pattern, a lifestyle, a deliberate choice he'd made over and over again while I'd been home being faithful and trusting and blind. There were receipts, too, tucked between the letters, receipts for hotels and restaurants and jewelry stores, all the evidence of romances I'd known nothing about. Charges he'd somehow hidden from me, probably through a credit card I didn't know existed, probably funded by money he'd diverted from our joint accounts or his income that he'd claimed was going to retirement savings and investments in our future. Our future. The phrase was almost funny now, sitting here surrounded by the ruins of every promise he'd ever made. I photographed everything. Every letter, every receipt, every bank statement, showing withdrawals that now made terrible sense. I took my time, making sure the images were clear, making sure the dates were visible, making sure I had documentation that would stand up in court. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, closed the drawer, locked it, returned the key to its hiding place. When he came home tomorrow or the next day, or whenever he decided to stop pretending he was at a business meeting, he would find nothing disturbed, nothing out of place, nothing to suggest that his carefully maintained facade had been breached. It was after midnight when I finished, and I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. I felt hollowed out, emptied of something essential, as if the betrayal had scooped out my insides and left only a shell behind. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast together thousands of times, where he'd read the paper while I'd made small talk about the weather and my day and the lives of people he'd never cared about. How many of those mornings had he been thinking about someone else? How many times had he kissed me goodbye and driven straight to her? My phone buzzed with a text message, and I knew without looking that it would be from him. I was right. Running late, the message said, as if I didn't know exactly where he was and what he was doing. Don't wait up. I'll be home soon. Love you. Those last two words were almost obscene in their casualness, tossed off like an afterthought, meaningless syllables he'd said so many times they'd lost all connection to actual feeling. I didn't respond. Let him wonder. Let him think I was asleep, trusting and oblivious. The good wife waiting at home. I looked at my phone, at the photos I'd taken in the parking garage, at the documentation I'd accumulated from his desk, and I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there, sharp and relentless, but it was joined now by something else, a cold, clear determination, a sense of purpose that I'd been lacking for years, maybe for my entire marriage. I had been sleepwalking through my life, accepting whatever scraps of affection he chose to throw my way, grateful for the privilege of being his wife. I had made myself so small, so accommodating, so easy to deceive. Never again. The lawyer's office was in a steel and glass building downtown, the kind of place that radiated competence and intimidation in equal measure. I arrived at 7:45, early enough to sit in my car and rehearse what I would say, how I would present the evidence, how I would make clear that this wasn't about emotion or hurt feelings, but about protecting myself and my future. I'd barely slept lying on the couch in our living room because I couldn't bear the thought of the bed we'd shared, listening to the clock tick through the small hours of the morning while my mind raced through scenarios and strategies and the logistics of untangling a decade of shared life. He'd come home around 2 in the morning, creeping in like a teenager sneaking past curfew, and I'd stayed perfectly still on the couch, breathing slowly and evenly, pretending to be asleep. I'd heard him pause in the doorway to the living room, probably wondering why I wasn't in bed, and I'd heard the moment he'd decided not to wake me, not to ask questions, to just accept this gift of my apparent unconsciousness. He'd gone upstairs alone, and I'd listened to the sounds of his nighttime routine, the running water and closing doors and creaking floorboards of our home settling in around his lies. This morning he'd been subdued at breakfast, not quite meeting my eyes, asking if I was feeling all right since I'd fallen asleep on the couch. I'd told him I had a headache, that I'd taken medication and passed out watching television, waiting for him to come home from his meeting. He'd accepted this without question, perhaps even with relief, and had kissed my forehead before leaving for work like he did every morning, like he was still the husband I'd thought he was, like nothing had changed. I'd waited until his car pulled out of the driveway before I'd grabbed my purse and my phone and driven to the lawyer's office, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind clear of everything except the task ahead. The lawyer, whose name was Patricia and who had kind eyes despite the steel in her voice, listened to my story without interruption. Then she looked at the photos on my phone, scrolling through them with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen this same scenario play out countless times before. When she was done, she looked up at me with an expression that might have been respect mixed with sympathy. "This is excellent documentation," she said. "Very clear, very specific, time-stamped and geotagged. This will make things considerably easier." She asked me questions then about our finances, about property, about whether we had children, which we didn't, thankfully, which meant there were no custody battles to fight, no little lives to be damaged by their father's choices. She asked about my income, about joint accounts, about whether I knew if he had any assets I wasn't aware of. I told her about what I'd found in his desk, about the bank statements and receipts, about the hidden credit card and the pattern of deception that seemed to go back years. She made notes, her pen scratching across paper, and then she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands on her desk. "Here's what we're going to do," she said, and I leaned forward, hungry for a plan, for action, for anything that would let me feel like I had some control over the chaos my life had become. "We're going to file immediately today, and we're going to ask for everything we're entitled to under the law. We're going to request a full accounting of all finances, including any accounts or credit cards you don't have access to. We're going to use these photos and the evidence of his infidelity to argue for a favorable settlement, though I should warn you that in this state, adultery doesn't affect the division of assets as much as people think it should. But," she continued, and here's where her expression turned sharp, predatory, "it does affect other things. Credibility, for instance. A judge who sees this level of deception, this pattern of lying and secret keeping, is going to question everything your husband says. If he claims certain income levels or expenses or financial hardships, the judge is going to be skeptical. And that, she said, tapping the photos on her phone screen, is where we gain our advantage. She asked me if I was sure, if I was ready to do this, if I understood that once we filed, there was no going back, that our marriage would be officially over, regardless of what he might say, or promise, or beg for. I looked at her and said yes without hesitation, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. We spent the next 2 hours going through paperwork, signing forms, laying out strategy. She explained the process, the timelines, the likely responses from his side once he was served with papers. She told me to document everything from this point forward, every interaction, every text message, every expense. She told me to open a separate bank account in my name only and to start funneling money there for legal fees and living expenses. She told me to change my passwords on everything, to secure my personal information, to think like someone who was going into battle. Because that's what divorce was, especially divorce from someone who clearly had things to hide. When I left her office, it was almost noon, and I felt different, lighter somehow, despite the weight of what I'd set in motion. I had taken action. I had stopped being a passive victim of circumstance and had become an active participant in my own life. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I drove to the bank and opened a new account, depositing the maximum amount I could transfer from our joint check in without raising immediate red flags. I changed the passwords on my email, my social media, my phone. I made a list of everything that was solely mine versus jointly owned, everything I would need to untangle from our shared life. Then I drove to a locksmith and had a new key made for my car, one that he didn't have access to because I'd read somewhere that controlling someone's mobility was a common tactic in divorces that turned ugly, and I wasn't taking any chances. I went to a storage facility and rented a small unit where I could store important documents and sentimental items I didn't want to risk losing in the chaos to come. I was thinking ahead, planning, protecting myself in ways I'd never thought I'd need to, and every action felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd given away without realizing it. It was late afternoon when I finally went home, and the house felt different, tainted somehow, no longer the sanctuary I'd tried to make it, but instead a stage where I'd been performing a role for an audience of one who hadn't even been watching. I made dinner out of habit, chicken and vegetables and rice, the kind of meal I'd made hundreds of times before, but tonight it felt mechanical, empty of the care I'd once put into it. When he came home at 6, right on time for once, he seemed cheerful, relaxed, probably buoyed by whatever had happened at that anniversary dinner with his mistress while I'd been home discovering the full extent of his betrayal. "How was your day?" he asked, loosening his tie. And I said it was fine, uneventful, just the usual routine. We ate dinner together, and he talked about work, about a big account he was closing, about office politics and commissions and things that I would have once listened to attentively, but that now sounded like meaningless noise. I made the appropriate sounds, asked the expected questions, played my part because I knew the papers hadn't been served yet, knew he had no idea what was coming, and I wanted to keep it that way as long as possible. After dinner, he retreated to his office, and I cleaned up the kitchen, wiping down counters and loading the dishwasher with the same methodical precision I'd employed for a decade. But my mind was elsewhere, running through scenarios, anticipating his reactions, preparing for the moment when the illusion would shatter and he would have to face what he'd done. I wondered if he would be angry or defensive, or if he would try to manipulate me into believing that somehow this was my fault, that I'd driven him to it by being too demanding, or not demanding enough, or any of the other ways women are blamed for men's failures. That night I slept in the guest room, claiming my headache had returned, and I didn't want to disturb him with my tossing and turning. He accepted this easily, perhaps even gratefully, and I lay in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room, thinking about all the nights I'd slept beside him, all the mornings I'd woken up next to a stranger I'd thought I knew. The intimacy of a decade of shared sleep, of turned backs and stolen covers, and synchronized breathing in the dark, all of it corrupted by the knowledge of his duplicity. I stared at the ceiling and wondered how long it would take to feel normal again, to feel like myself again, to remember who I was before I'd defined myself primarily as his wife. The papers were served 3 days later on a Tuesday afternoon while he was at work. I knew because Patricia called me to confirm, her voice professional but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. He's been served, she said. Expect a phone call. Expect drama. Remember what we discussed about not engaging, about keeping communication through attorneys. I thanked her and hung up and sat in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store where I'd been buying food I no longer had the appetite to eat. And I waited. The phone rang 20 minutes later, and his name flashed across the screen, and I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately, and again and again. 5 calls in 10 minutes, and I ignored them all, listening instead to the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and calm, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Finally, a text message. What the fuck is this? Are you serious? Call me right now. We need to talk about this. This is insane. More messages flooded in, a torrent of outrage and confusion and demands that I respond, that I explain, that I justify this incomprehensible assault on our marriage. I turned off my phone and drove home, and when I pulled into the driveway, his car was already there, parked at a crooked angle like he'd arrived in a hurry, and I sat in my car for a long moment, gathering my courage, reminding myself that I had every right to do this, that I owed him nothing, that his feelings were no longer my responsibility. He met me at the door, his face red with anger, the divorce papers crumpled in his fist. What the hell is this? He shouted, waving them at me like evidence of my betrayal. And the irony of that would have been funny if it weren't so enraging. You want a divorce just like that? Without even talking to me? Without giving me a chance to explain? I walked past him into the house, set my purse on the table, and turned to face him. Explain what exactly? I asked, my voice steady, detached. Explain why you took your mistress to our anniversary dinner. Explain why you've been having affairs for years. Explain why I found love letters from multiple women in your desk drawer. The color drained from his face, and I watched him cycle through the predictable stages of a liar caught in his lies. Denial first, sputtering claims that I was crazy, that I'd misunderstood, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Then anger, defensive and aggressive, trying to turn this around on me, asking how dare I go through his private things, accusing me of being paranoid and controlling. Then, when he saw that neither of those tactics was working, when he understood from my expression that I wasn't going to be gaslit or manipulated or convinced that my own eyes had lied to me, he tried a different approach. Tears. I made mistakes, he said, his voice breaking, his eyes filling with water that might or might not have been genuine. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. It didn't mean anything. They didn't mean anything. You're my wife. You're the one I love. We can fix this. We can go to therapy. I'll do whatever it takes. Please don't throw away 10 years over a mistake. I looked at him, this man I'd loved, this man I'd built my life around, and I felt nothing except a distant sort of pity mixed with disgust. A mistake, I said slowly, is something that happens once. Forgetting to pick up milk is a mistake. This, I gestured at the papers still clutched in his hand, at the evidence I had of his years of deception. This is not a mistake. This is a choice. 1,000 choices, and you made every single one of them knowing exactly what you were doing. He tried to approach me, to take my hands, to use physical intimacy as a tool of manipulation, but I stepped back. Don't touch me, I said, and something in my voice must have convinced him I meant it because he stopped, his hands falling to his sides. The divorce is happening, I continued. Nothing you say or do is going to change that. My lawyer will be in touch with your lawyer, assuming you hire one, and we'll settle this like adults. But we're done. This marriage is over. It's been over for a long time. I just didn't know it until recently. What about everything we built together? He asked, and now the tears were definitely real, streaming down his face, making him look pathetic and somehow younger, like a child caught doing something wrong. What about our home, our life, our future? I almost laughed. What we built. I built this home. I maintained it. I cleaned it. I decorated it. I turned it into something warm and welcoming while you were out there building other things with other women. And our future? You destroyed that. You destroyed it every time you lied to me, every time you betrayed me, every time you looked me in the eye and pretended to be faithful while planning your next affair. He sank onto the couch, his head in his hands, and I stood there watching him, feeling nothing but a cold satisfaction that he was finally experiencing even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. The thing about betrayal, I said quietly, is that it's not just about the cheating, it's about the lying. It's about the hundreds of little deceptions that made the cheating possible. It's about coming home every night and kissing me with lips that had kissed someone else. It's about sleeping in our bed after sleeping in someone else's. It's about saying you love me while actively choosing to hurt me. That's what I can't forgive, not the sex, although that's bad enough, but the sustained, deliberate dishonesty, the fact that you looked at me every day and decided I wasn't worth your honesty or your loyalty. I left him there and went upstairs to pack more of my things. I'd already moved the most important items to the storage unit, but now I filled suitcases with clothes and shoes and the few pieces of jewelry that had been gifts from my family rather than from him. I stripped the bedroom of everything that was mine, every book and photograph and personal item, erasing myself from the space we'd shared. And with each item I packed, I felt lighter, freer, more like the person I'd been before I'd met him. I could hear him downstairs talking on the phone, probably to his mother or his friends, spinning his version of events, painting me as the unreasonable one, the one who wouldn't forgive, the one who was throwing away a good marriage over nothing. Let him talk, let him tell whatever story made him feel better about himself. I had the truth, documented and time-stamped and irrefutable. I had evidence that would stand up in court, that would protect me in the settlement, that would ensure his lies wouldn't cost me anything more than they already had. When I came back downstairs with my suitcases, he tried one more time. Please, he said, blocking my path to the door. Please don't do this. I love you. I'll change. I'll be better. Just give me one more chance. I looked at him and I wondered if he'd ever actually loved me or if I'd just been convenient, a placeholder, someone to maintain his home and his image while he pursued whatever excitement he thought he was missing. I don't believe you, I said simply. And even if you did love me, even if every word you're saying right now is true, it doesn't matter. Because I don't love you anymore. I don't even like you. You're a stranger to me and not a particularly impressive one. Now move. He moved and I walked past him and out the door and into my car, loading my suitcases into the trunk. And I didn't look back at the house or at him standing in the doorway, didn't give him the dramatic exit he probably wanted, the scene he could point to later as evidence of my coldness or cruelty. I just drove away, and with every mile between me and that house, I felt something inside me starting to breathe again, starting to remember what it felt like to be whole. I'd rented an apartment, a small furnished place in a neighborhood I'd always liked, but we'd never considered because he'd thought it was too trendy, too expensive, too full of young people who stayed up late and made noise. It was perfect. One bedroom, hardwood floors, big windows that let in afternoon light, and a balcony where I could sit and drink coffee and watch the world go by without anyone asking me questions or making demands or lying to my face. I moved in that night, unpacking my suitcases, arranging my things in drawers and closets that were mine alone, and I ordered takeout from a restaurant we'd never been to because he hadn't liked that kind of food. And I ate it sitting on the floor because my furniture hadn't been delivered yet, and I felt more at peace than I had in years. The divorce process was ugly, as Patricia had warned me it would be. He fought every point, contested every claim, tried to argue that the affairs didn't matter, that we should split everything 50-50 regardless of his infidelity. His lawyer was aggressive, sending letters full of accusations and threats, painting me as vindictive and money hungry, claiming I was trying to punish him financially for his personal failings. But Patricia was better, sharper, more prepared. She presented the evidence systematically, building a case that showed not just infidelity, but financial deception, hidden assets, misappropriation of joint funds for his affairs. She requested a forensic accountant to go through all our finances, and what they found was damning. He'd been siphoning money from our joint account for years, thousands of dollars that I'd thought was going toward retirement and investments, but was actually funding his double life. hotel rooms and expensive dinners and jewelry for women who weren't me. A secret credit card with a balance in the tens of thousands, all of it spent on maintaining his affairs. When the accountant presented their findings in court, I watched my soon to be ex husband's lawyer's face go pale, watched him lean over and have a heated, whispered conversation with his client, and I knew we'd won. Not just the case, but something larger, the truth, validation, proof that I hadn't been crazy or paranoid or unreasonable, proof that everything I'd suspected and more had been real. The judge was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every variation of human weakness and wasn't impressed by any of it. She listened to both sides, reviewed the evidence, and then delivered her ruling with a briskness that suggested she had better things to do than deal with yet another case of marital infidelity. The marriage was dissolved. The assets were to be divided, but not equally. Given the evidence of financial deception and the diversion of marital funds for extramarital affairs, the judge awarded me 60% of the marital assets, including the house, which would be sold and the proceeds divided according to that ratio. He was responsible for the debt on the secret credit card. He was ordered to pay my legal fees. It was more than I'd hoped for, more than Patricia had thought we'd get. When we left the courthouse, he tried to approach me one last time, tried to say something, but Patricia stepped between us and said in a voice that could cut glass, "All future communication goes through me. You are not to contact my client directly. Am I clear?" He nodded, defeated, and I watched him walk away, shoulders slumped, looking older than his years, and I felt nothing. Not vindication, not satisfaction, not even pity. Just a profound relief that it was over, that I would never have to see him or speak to him or pretend to be his wife ever again. The house sold quickly in a market that was favorable to sellers, and when the proceeds were divided and the check deposited into my account, I stared at the number for a long time, understanding that this was the monetary value of 10 years of my life, of a marriage that had been built on lies, of trust that had been systematically betrayed. It was more money than I'd ever had access to at once, and I used it wisely. I paid off my car, I fully furnished my apartment. I invested the rest, working with a financial advisor who helped me understand that security wasn't about having a husband. It was about having resources and knowledge and the ability to support myself. I went back to school, taking classes I'd always wanted to take but hadn't because he'd thought they were impractical or a waste of money. I made new friends, women who'd been through similar experiences, who understood what it meant to rebuild yourself after the person you'd trusted most had shattered your faith in everything. I started therapy, working through the layers of betrayal and self blame and the complicated grief of mourning, not just a marriage, but the person I'd been in that marriage, the woman who'd made herself small and accommodating and easy to deceive. Slowly, painfully, I began to find myself again, the person I'd been before I'd met him, before I'd learned to define myself through his needs and desires and approval. I remembered things I'd liked, hobbies I'd abandoned, dreams I'd set aside. I started painting again, something I'd done in college but had given up because we'd needed the spare room for his office, because there was never time, because his career had always taken priority over my creative impulses. I painted abstracts, violent splashes of color that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wounded inside me. And then gradually, as the months passed, the paintings became softer, more hopeful, less about rage and more about rebirth. I ran into her once, the woman from the parking garage, in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning. She didn't recognize me, but I recognized her immediately, and I watched as she ordered her drink, laughing with the barista, seemingly unburdened by guilt or conscience. I wondered if she knew he was married when they started their affair, if she'd cared, if she'd thought about the wife at home who trusted and believed and never suspected. I wondered if she was still with him now, if they'd moved past the scandal and the divorce and built something together, or if he'd already found someone new to deceive, because men like him rarely changed, rarely learned, rarely saw their own behavior as anything more than a series of unfortunate circumstances that happened to them rather than choices they made. I left the coffee shop without speaking to her, without confronting her, or making a scene, because she wasn't the villain in my story any more than any of the others had been. He was. He was the one who'd made vows and broken them. He was the one who'd looked me in the eye every day and chosen to lie. The women were just symptoms of a larger disease, and confronting them wouldn't cure anything, or change anything, or make me feel any better. So I walked away, and I went home to my apartment, to my space, to the life I was building that belonged only to me. A year after the divorce was finalized, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and it was him. "I know I'm not supposed to contact you," he said, his voice tentative, almost apologetic. "But I wanted you to know I'm sorry, really sorry. I've been in therapy, and I'm working on myself, and I realize now how badly I hurt you. I just wanted you to know that you didn't deserve any of it. It was all me, all my fault, and I'm sorry." I listened in silence, and when he was done, I said, "Thank you for that." And then I hung up. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need his acknowledgement of wrongdoing, or his therapeutic insights, or his attempts to make amends. Those things were for him, to help him sleep better at night, to make him feel like less of a monster. What I needed, I'd already found. I'd found my strength. I'd found my independence. I'd found the version of myself who didn't need anyone's validation or approval to know her own worth. I blocked his number after that call, erasing the last possible avenue for him to reach me, cutting the final thread that connected us. And then I went back to my life, the life I was actively choosing rather than passively accepting, and I was happy. Not the uncomplicated happiness of ignorance, not the false contentment of denial, but the hard-won, complicated, deeply earned happiness of someone who'd walked through fire and come out the other side, fundamentally changed but ultimately stronger. I'd learned that I could survive betrayal, I could survive heartbreak, I could survive the destruction of everything I'd thought my life was supposed to be, and not just survive, but thrive. I dated eventually, cautiously at first, testing the waters of trust with men who showed up consistently, who said what they meant, who didn't have secret phones or hidden credit cards or patterns of behavior that set off the alarm bells I'd learned to listen to. Some of those relationships lasted weeks, some months, and one lasted nearly a year before we both realized we were better as friends than as partners. And that was okay. I wasn't in a hurry. I wasn't desperate to replace what I'd lost. I was learning to be enough for myself, to find fulfillment in work I cared about, and friendships that nourished me, and solitary evenings spent painting or reading, or simply existing without the constant need to accommodate someone else's preferences and needs. On what would have been our 12th anniversary, I took myself to that same restaurant, the one where I'd discovered his betrayal, and I sat at a table alone and ordered the most expensive item on the menu and a glass of champagne, and I toasted to myself, to survival, to the courage it takes to walk away from something broken rather than spending your whole life trying to fix it. The waiter looked at me curiously, a woman alone celebrating something, and I smiled at him and said nothing because my story was mine to keep, and I no longer needed to explain myself to anyone. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, driving to that anniversary dinner in the emerald dress, excited and nervous and so painfully unaware of what was waiting for her in that parking garage. I thought about how that discovery had felt like the end of the world, like the destruction of everything I'd built, like a death that left me hollow and lost. And now, sitting in that same restaurant wearing a dress I'd chosen because I liked it rather than because someone else did, I understood that it hadn't been an ending. It had been a beginning, the beginning of the rest of my life, the life where I was the protagonist rather than the supporting character in someone else's story. I finished my meal slowly, savoring each bite, and when I was done, I paid the check with my own money, money I'd earned and managed and invested wisely. And I walked out of that restaurant into the cool evening air feeling complete. Not healed, exactly, because some wounds leave scars that never fully fade, but whole, strong, capable of protecting myself in ways I'd never known I needed to learn. The parking garage was well lit now, better than it had been 2 years ago, and I walked to my car without fear, without the ghost of that terrible discovery haunting my steps. I'd reclaim this space, reclaim this night, reclaim my own narrative from the wreckage he'd made of it. As I drove home through the city streets, past the house we'd shared that now belonged to someone else, past the turns I used to take on autopilot when my life was smaller and more constrained, I felt grateful. Not for the betrayal itself, never for that, but for what it had forced me to become stronger, wiser, more cautious, but also more certain of my own value. I'd learned that I could trust my instincts, that the small voice that whispered something's wrong was worth listening to. I'd learned that evidence mattered, that documentation protected you, that love without honesty was just another form of manipulation. I'd learned that some things, once broken, shouldn't be fixed. They should be acknowledged, grieved, and then left behind so you can move forward unencumbered by the weight of what they used to be. The apartment was dark when I arrived, and I moved through it, turning on lights, making tea, changing into comfortable clothes, settling into the evening routine I'd created for myself. On my desk was a photograph of me from last month, taken by a friend at an art show where I'd displayed 3 of my paintings. In the photo, I was smiling, really smiling, not the careful, practiced smile of a woman trying to keep peace, but a genuine expression of joy and pride and accomplishment. I looked at that photo every day, reminding myself of how far I'd come, of the person I was becoming, of the life I was building brick by brick with my own hands, rather than waiting for someone else to build it for me. This was my story now, not the story of a woman betrayed, although that was part of it, but the story of a woman who'd taken that betrayal and transformed it into catalyst for change. The story of a woman who'd looked at the ruins of her marriage and decided to build something better from the rubble. The story of a woman who'd learned finally and completely that she was enough all by herself without needing anyone else's validation or approval or love to make her whole. And that knowledge, that bone deep certainty of my own worth, was worth more than any marriage, any relationship, any false promise of forever. I was free, I was strong, I was exactly where I needed to be. If you love this story, please leave a comment below and get the conversation going. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and support this channel. My love and respect goes out to you.